Hi, everybody. Welcome to the W3C panel. I have here on stage with me several editors and one missing editor. I have several editors of specifications and one implementer. So let me just introduce you to those folks and talk a little bit about what we hope you are going to get out of this panel. So this is Elika Edamad. You probably know her as Fantasy. She's a CSS spec editor. She's one of the more prolific people in CSS. We have Robert Nyman. He works with Firefox. Oh, I'm sorry, and Elika is with Mozilla as well.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. So Robert Nyman spoke today on device APIs for Firefox OS, and he has insights into that. He's not an editor, so we're thinking about not having him on the panel, but we decided you guys might have questions for him. We have Jacob Rossi. Jacob is, he works for Microsoft. He's the editor of the pointer event specification and some other stuff at W3C. We have Tav Mjong. I'll just call him Tav. Tav Mba he is an implementer on Inkscape, which is an open source SVG authoring tool, and he's also on the SVG working group. We have Chris Wilson. Chris Wilson works for Google, and he is the editor of the Web API, the Web Audio API, and the Web MIDI API, and he also he's giving a presentation on WebRTC tomorrow, I think. Jacob is giving a presentation on pointer events and sundry things tomorrow. Today. 5 o'clock. Elika, you're speaking tomorrow at...
Today, 5 p.m. on BiDi.
I'm clearly very organized, and she's speaking on BiDi, bidirectional text. And Alan Stearns on the end there spoke earlier today. He is the editor of CSS regions, exclusions, and shapes, 3 different CSS specs, and he works for Adobe. So what I hope you're going to get out of this presentation is I hope you're going to feel free to ask us questions about how things work at W3C, how decisions are made, how you can participate, and come away with an understanding of basically how W3C works and how the developer community feeds back into that process. And to get you started, I'd like to invite Elika up to the podium, and she's going to talk about a day in the life of a spec developer.
Hi, so I'm Fantasy. I'm legally known as Elika J. Edamad. That's the name that appears on my specs. I edit a lot of CSS specs. You could also ask, what specs do I not edit? Mostly the ones that Alan edits. I've been on the CSS working groups officially since 2004, but we also have a public mailing list. I've been there since 2000. So I've been doing CSS stuff for about 14 years, 10 years of which were in the CSS working group. And I'm going to take you a little bit through what I do. This is where I live. This is the www style mailing list of the W3C, which is where the CSS working group's discussions happen. All of our technical discussions happen here, and the ones that happen in meetings face-to-face get their transcripts posted here. I'll show you a transcript. Like this. You can see all of our discussions and why did we make the decisions we did, and if you're really excited about that, you can go read all of them. But yeah, so as you can see, there's about 60,000 messages in this little envelope here. I've read probably more than half of them, and and so what is the mailing list for? The mailing list is for making our CSS specs, and spec kind of looks like this. It describes the features that are in this module and gives some examples and explanations. And the process of making a spec is basically you draft up this document, you post it to the internet comes back and tells you all the ways in which you are wrong, and they post it to www style, and then you get to respond to each and every message that complains about the problems with your spec and try to make the spec better. And then you post draft number 2, and the same thing happens again. And eventually you get to the point where people are kind of like, well, we think the spec's mostly pretty good. And then you're like, okay, I think I'm done. But then they start to implement it and they find more bugs in the spec. So it's kind of like software development, except it's with English. So what kinds of things we discussed? There's things like, what is the syntax of making a shape, or whether or not code points categorized as TR in Unicode should be upright or sideways when you typeset them vertically. And the discussions can be super detailed or super kind of like surface. And that's most of what you do as a spec editor. You just pull up your specs. And you would think most of my time is actually spent in my text editor here, but it's not. It's spent on the mailing list and tracking issues. So that is what a spec editor does, is you spend a lot of time in a mailing list arguing with people. Okay, I'm done.
Thanks, Alika. So I also want to, I didn't tell you a little bit more about the format of this presentation. So I'm going to have 2 more presentations, and then we're just going to open it up to questions from the audience. So next, we have Chris Wilson, and he's just going to present from right there, and he's going to tell you a little bit about web audio API, the web MIDI API, and sundry other things, all in 5 minutes.
All in 5 minutes. Is this on? Oh, there we go. So I actually didn't have a presentation. I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience, which I actually used to be a member of the CSS working group since its inception, but kind of backed away from that nervously many years ago. And I came back in to work on the web audio working group because I found it really fascinating what was going on in web audio. But one of the interesting things is that web audio is a little bit different than CSS because the original spec was designed and developed by one person. He was a Google employee up until fairly recently when he left. And he was the sole spec editor for a long time. And this actually is kind of, frankly, a somewhat warped way to build a web standard. And I think that's become very apparent over the last year or so as Mozilla has picked up web audio and has been implementing it, and they'll hit parts and say, wait, but this is really hard to do in a broad architectural view, or what the heck is this supposed to do, which is the usual problem, actually, is parts that are really not well specified in the spec, because the specification really is supposed to be something that not only a web developer could pick up and figure out how to use, but another implementer could pick up the specification and build an entirely interoperable implementation of that specification from that spec. You shouldn't have to go trolling through, Mozilla's source code or WebKit source code or Blink source code in order to figure out what's going on, or as we used to do back in the day, reverse engineer everything to figure out what the behavior is, because that, it turns out, is very hard to do in the long run. So we actually, about, I want to say 3 months ago, when the sole spec editor of web audio, Chris Rogers, left Google and also simultaneously left the web audio working group, we suddenly needed another editor. And myself and Paul Adeno from Mozilla stepped in and said, hey, we'll be co-editors, which is kind of good because it gives a nice, sort of checks and balances, like he knows not to check major changes into the spec without running them past the group, or I'm going to call him on it and go back them out, and vice versa. But it also means that we're both really committed to narrowing the spec down and figuring out exactly what we're trying to ship, and I think that's kind of our current goal. So I'm going to stop there. A lot of my experience with spec editing is actually very similar to Elika's. I spend far more time in email than I do in a text editor on the spec, but I could go on about audio all day, so I'm not even going to touch that.
And you are going to go on about audio later on. So thank you, Chris. A round of applause for Chris, if you think he deserves it. And next, I'd like to welcome Jacob Rossi up to the podium, and he's going to talk a little bit about developing pointer events.
Okay, so you heard a little bit about day in the life of an editor and maybe a glimpse into at least the work side of our lives. So I kind of want to take you through a history of a single spec. In this modern day of modern browsers, specs come about a lot differently than they used to. So how we're defining them, how we're implementing them, how we're iterating on them is changing. And so this is just one example. So it's not necessarily the case that all specs work the same way. A little bit about me. I work at Microsoft. I've been there for 3 years. I'm on the Internet Explorer team. And I've been involved with the W3C for about 5 years through a lot of the major working groups, web app security, HTML, as of this morning, CSS, and pointer events. So about, let's see, 3 years ago, we were looking at devices and forecasts of where we thought things were going to go. Touch was really starting to take off. And now, where we thought devices would go is actually really coming to be true. It's no longer the case necessarily that a touch device is a touch-only device. You have things like the Chromebook Pixel or the Surface, or even phones that have pens, graphic artist tablets of many different sizes, and we recognized problems out there for web developers. Just as an example, we saw a lot of this on the web. If window.touch event, add event listener touch start, else add event listener mouse down, and what this means is it assumes you had a touch-only device. So if I go grab my tablet that has a USB port and I plug in a mouse, or I have my Chromebook Pixel with a trackpad, my mouse stops working. Oops. So we thought we could design something that's a little bit more forward-thinking and something that's potentially more compatible with devices beyond just what we're using today. And so we came up with this idea. At the time we called it MS Pointer, and it abstracted these concepts into a single entity called a pointer. Whether it was mouse or a finger on the screen or a pen, you can envision leap motion, connect, vision, etc. Into the single concept. And we shipped a preview, an early version, a preview release of IE10. And we got lots of great feedback, good, bad, excitement, disdain, and we listened to that feedback, and we saw additional problems that we could solve. For example, we really needed to have native light performance. That's a must, and this is a joke for all the other folks on the panel here. This is just an example here in the touch events model and in the original MS Pointer implementation. You could call a method and tell the browser to not handle the touch, don't do panning, don't do zooming. I'm going to handle it on my own. Well, we saw a lot of code that did this right here. Maybe not computing the human genome, but you get the point. Calculating digits of pi, whatever it was, you decided to go run in JavaScript. And so if it turns out you didn't call prevent default or whatever, then we just wasted a whole lot of time running your JavaScript only to decide we're going to go pan the web page. And so it stutters when you slide your finger across it. And this wasn't good. So we evolved it further again, and we made it play it a little better with your hardware. So we introduced the touch action CSS property, and nice formatting, 4x3. So we introduced touch action for CSS. This lets you declaratively evolve or declare whether you should pan or zoom, or you should handle the events in JavaScript. This enables browsers to take what has historically been a single-threaded browser and move it off, use the GPU, use multiple threads for panning and zooming. And that was a real big win that most of the folks involved with the spec are really excited about. And so by this time, after we had iterated a little bit, a spec was born. We made a member submission just about a year ago. And I'm not sure this graphic has the best connotations lately, but yeah, the point here is that there is a process we go through, and it evolves to a certain level of maturity and starts to get towards interoperability, which is, standards are sort of the means to that end. Pointer events has gone actually pretty fast for a web standard. Pretty happy with the progress there. It's a candidate recommendation. We're moving in towards testing now. We're using excellent projects like Test the Web Forward to help crowdsource and get web developers and JavaScript frameworks and implementers alike testing these specifications and ensuring that that when you guys write code, it's going to work everywhere. Lots of people are contributing. You can too. This isn't just like, there's not some special degree that we have or anything like that. It's a public pointer events mailing list. Send your mail, and I'll +1 I spend more time in mail than I do writing in the text editor. And so, like I said, the end goal here is interop. So there's lots of great places that you can use pointer events today. It's available unprefixed now in IE11. The Google Polymer project has an excellent polyfill. There's Dojo support, Cordova plugin. There's implementation work going on for experimental support in Blink and Gecko, so Chrome and Firefox and Opera. jQuery is working on this, and like I said, Tesla Web 4 is working on test collateral. One extra fact you might not know, there's actually a division at Microsoft, it's pretty new here, called Microsoft Open Technologies, and they're involved in a lot of these projects through open source to promote interoperability. So we're actually working on contributing code towards a lot of these open source projects so that you can use a model that works across devices and across input methods.
Thanks, Jacob. So I neglected to say, to introduce myself when I was going through the round of introductions. My name is Doug Sheppers. I work for W3C. We make web standards. And if you have questions, if anybody has questions, there are 2 microphones up here. If you don't want to come up for a question, you can tweet you can tweet your question with the hashtag W3C. If you don't have questions, and I'm hoping you do, because this is about you guys asking questions, I'll lob some softballs to the audience. Does anybody have a question? We have a taker.
I have a question about CSS. As you know, in recent times, such tool as less has appeared. And one of the cool features in less that I find myself is that you can nest rules. Is CSS going to support this? And how soon?
Is it on? Just keep testing. Is the mic on?
Should be. Talk into it.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Why don't you step up?
Keep talking.
So this has definitely come up on the mailing list multiple times. There's one of the complications is some parsing restrictions that we have, like that a tag selector will be ambiguous with a property name. So that's one of the restrictions that we have. So the idea's been passed back and forth across the mailing list, but we don't have any really concrete proposal that everyone thinks is a good idea yet. So, but it's definitely like sitting in the back of people's minds.
And we definitely have people in the working group who are very interested in working on this particular problem and getting something solved. We just need a good idea to start with.
Yeah.
So I had a question, I think specifically for the gentleman from Microsoft, or somebody else might have an answer as well. I've been looking particularly external protocol launches. Oh, hey, there's the mic. External protocol launches, and I know Microsoft and IE has an API, MS Launch URI, which is nice because it gives you feedback on handling external protocols so you can respond appropriately in your web application. Have you done any work with W3C trying to standardize that at all? And if so, can you give me any details on that?
So there's not been any official work yet on that, but we have heard interest in that from other folks, and so it's certainly something we're considering, and we get it. Interop is good. So I don't have anything official that I can tell you, but I think it's something that we're looking at.
Are you concerned about pushback? I know there's been some, I've heard some responses from particularly Mozilla about the possibility of fingerprinting users based on external protocol capabilities, and that might be a blocker for something like that.
We did do some work to tune that and be conscious around some of the problematic scenarios that could exist with such an API. I'm really not an expert in how it works, so it wouldn't behoove me to comment on the specifics. So.
Okay, thank you.
Hey guys. Oh, there we go. I have a question for Jacob. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about Internet Explorer's plans around possibly supporting web components in the coming future, if there are plans, or maybe even not for like all things web components, but perhaps specific specs that you guys might be interested in.
So I love web components. I think they're a great thing. We've been involved in the standardization process there. I remember a couple TPACs ago, the original pitch. It's sitting in a hotel suite, literally just huddled around a laptop. It was kind of a fun experience, and I think it's a good thing. Microsoft in Internet Explorer have had some experience previously with component models. Other folks have as well, and I can say it's extremely important to get right. There are lots of performance implications, and amongst other things that if we don't get it right, it's going to be a tax for the rest of our implementations for years to come. So it's certainly something we're looking at. We just released IE11, so I don't know what the roadmap necessarily looks like going forward, but we're going to stay involved in the spec, and it's something that we're interested in.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, in terms of previous component models, HTML components, HTCs was one of the previous ones. Yeah.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to answer that question? It's about Microsoft in general, but it might be, like, I'm curious what Adobe thinks. Hey, what does Google think about web components? No, I'm interested in what Adobe thinks about web components, because from an authoring perspective, do you have any perspective there?
I really like web components, and I'm trying to figure out how my specs work with web components and with shadow boundaries particularly, to make sure that everything fits in and will work with the eventual component model that we settle on.
I'm going to insert an editorial note here. Jacob said TPAC, and that probably doesn't mean anything to the people in this room. TPAC stands for Technical Plenary and Advisory Committee Meeting. Each working group, so W3C is broken up into working groups that work on different things. There's a CSS working group, there's an SVG working group, etc. And each of those working groups has face-to-face meetings periodically for most of them. And TPAC is the one where all the working groups get together and they have liaisons with one another. They talk about how things should interoperate, and it's a large event with hundreds of working group participants. I just wanted to drop that in there. And you had a question. So two questions.
So I've read a little bit before on working groups and the W3C, and it seems like a pretty cool thing how everybody kind of gets together and can have a say. I'm confused. What's the process like after something gets brought into the spec of browser support for it? Is that something you guys kind of try to push, or is it something that's just kind of up to the browser makers to choose what they support, what they don't support?
It's pretty much up to the browser vendors. The fact that they're in the working group gives us a sense of what they're interested in, because they'll let us know that they hate this idea, or like they think that's really cool and they want to help it move along. But we don't have any way to force anything. If the browsers feel something's useful, they'll implement it, and if they don't, then they won't.
And I'll just add to that as a part of how the specs get produced, there are certain stages in the process that require implementation experience. In particularly, for it to become a final recommendation, it needs two interoperable implementations. So there are sort of checks and balances, if I can keep with the analogy, to make sure that implementations do happen in order for something to become a standard.
And speak as a W3C person, we try not to form a working group if we don't think there's interest in implementing it, because that's useless. I mean, we have an active review process at multiple stages along the process of becoming a specification. As somebody, so I started the web audio working group, for example, because I saw that there was some initial work out there, but I thought there needed to be interoperability, and so I went to the different vendors and I said, hey, are you interested in joining this working group? And we got Mozilla, we got Google. They had already been doing some work there, so we pulled them together, brought them into a group, and put them into a room, and one spec or two specs enter, one spec leaves. But the fact of the matter is, we wouldn't have formed a group if we hadn't gotten a consensus among the various key players that this was something that they wanted to work on.
I could also say from an implementer perspective that it totally depends on what the spec is about, and especially things that we work on with web APIs are, in a number of cases, trying things out. So we could start by implementing something, other, Microsoft, Google, etc., look at it, think it's a good thing, and we sort of with web components as well, we play around with it, and then when you sort of see which direction you want to go, then you start actually properly specifying it. Because like Jacob said, you do want to get things right. And you can't do it by only writing or by only testing. It's kind of a mix match between those two.
And one last thing, we talk a lot about testing. There's sort of an implicit notion at W3C that we need to have two separate implementable, interoperable implementations of a feature and a specification before that feature is, we decide, yes, that feature should stay in the specification. And it can't go forward without that, because we want the specifications to reflect reality as much as possible. And we also want it to make sure that when people are reading specs to implement them, that they understand properly how the spec goes. And so we have elaborate test suites, and you can help do that. You can help with those test suites, by the way. If you go to testthewebforward.org, that's a crowdsourcing effort to improve interoperability among browsers by submitting tests. Go ahead.
So segue to this topic. A standard is as good as how widespread it is being implemented. So a good example is the grid layout. While Microsoft is pushing it really hard, the other vendors just like dragging their feet. What's the reason for not getting the standards getting implemented? At least within a year or so.
Okay. So sometimes it takes a lot longer than a year to actually work out all of the design flaws and implementation details of this particular spec. Like, especially layout in particular is a very difficult area to write a spec around, because you want to have it, there's tons of details about exactly how everything interacts with all of the auto sizing that happens in CSS. And that's a lot of complicated constraints and algorithms that has to fit into, like, well, if you nest a grid inside a Flexbox, inside a table, and like it's all auto-sized, like, and some of it's got percentages, and others of it's got viewport units, like this all has to work. So that's a lot of work to actually work out all the kinks in the spec. And then there's a high-level design of, like, the UI for CSS is its syntax. And so we want to make sure that the syntax is understandable and expresses the kinds of constraints and thinking that's in the minds of the author. And CSS is slightly more complicated than other places because you don't fixed size everything. It's all auto size. So if it needs to grow and shrink in response to something, we have to make sure that it's growing and shrinking the way the author wants it to do and not some other way. So working out all of these things takes some time. So layout specs in particular take a lot of time. And grid layout is a layout spec. So for example, Microsoft proposed like a grid layout spec, like, I don't know, what was it, 5 or 6 years ago? At least, yeah. That was, no, and that one required a lot of absolute positioning, and the layout did not respond to the contents and things like that. And so we sent it back to their drawing board and said, this isn't going to work for the web because we want things to auto-size and handle odd user-generated content, varying window sizes, all of this kind. And they came back with a new spec which addressed all of that feedback, but some of the syntax was really awkward and we didn't quite understand. Like the algorithm, there was concerns from like more print-oriented people about how they address different lines. And so the last year, that spec has been going through a lot of design changes, which is why Mozilla and Google have been and WebKit have been holding off a bit on implementing it until that design phase settled. Now we're really close to done with that. And the next phase of it's going to be working out all of those details that I mentioned, like making sure the algorithm's actually correctly and fully specified. So it's making progress, but to a certain extent, like, if the implementers are interested, they really want to do it, but they also want to wait until the spec settles down and all the design decisions are made before they jump in and start doing a lot of work that they would potentially have to redo if we change things around.
So do vendors really communicate?
So the question was, do vendors freely communicate about this?
The issues.
Yes.
And that's what the mailing lists are for.
Right. So the mailing list has.
If you have more questions, go to the mic so people can hear you.
So if Microsoft in their browsers for like 2 iterations now. What makes the other vendors hesitate and
Because the spec that we're coming out with is actually different from what Microsoft has implemented. So
I see.
the feedbacks that going into the spec cycles is resulting in something different.
There's also another really important point here, which is that, and Elika kind of touched on this early on in her response, which is basically each implementer gets to choose what web standards they want to implement. I mean, there are tons of specs out there, and I don't know of any browser that implements every single standard that's out there. Certainly every single thing that's even up to a candidate recommendation. Because there's a lot there. I mean, there's just an incredible surface area, and I think it's great that we have all of these efforts ongoing at the same time. But at the same time, like, you know, if I wanted to rip on people on this, I'd say, well, Microsoft's not even really participating in the audio working group, so I'm not getting any of their feedback. Could you go fix that, please? Yeah, I mean, I'm being nice, you know, I'm hoping that the nice thing works this time. But I mean, my point is basically like it's not in their priorities right now to do that. And I can go and try to convince them and, you know, like show them all the really cool stuff that gets added to the web platform if you do that, but they get to make that decision for their own browser. And with grid layout, I'd actually say the reason why it's not been such an incredible priority is because there have been a bunch of other tools that have been fulfilling a somewhat similar need, but probably more targeted to a lot of the scalability across tons of devices that we need to focus on right now. Like we have Flexbox, as Alan just said to me beforehand, you know, you can actually use Flexbox now. Like that's really critically important, that you can actually use it across all of these browsers and that actually interoperates for the most part. And that has been a priority, and you can fulfill a lot of the same kind of needs. Back when we started building the .NET Frameworks 3.0 at Microsoft, you know, we looked at what we needed to really build UI layout, because we had HTML and we had CSS. We didn't have a bunch of the advanced CSS that we have today, of course, but because this was, you know, 10, 12 years ago. But we looked at it and it was basically like there were 2 main layouts that made up 95% of all UI layouts, and it was stacking boxes and grids. And if you even had just one of those that worked really well for UI, you could do most UI. But we didn't have either one in CSS at the time. The best we had was table layout, which is not a grid layout. You know, it's just not. And now at least we have one of them, so progress.
I just wanted to add that, you know, Elika kind of soft-sold the specs process, saying, well, there's been design changes in the spec. I would say there have been design improvements in the spec, quite substantial improvements over the last year. So if Chrome and Safari and Firefox had jumped in and implemented grid a couple of years ago, we'd be stuck with a grid system that had some limitations that we are now fixing on the specs level. Once we actually do get this new version of the spec implemented, you'll be much better off.
So
just to emphasize Alan's point, once something ships in multiple browsers, you can't change it. Like whatever,
too much content.
Whatever we screwed up is screwed up forever.
And it's frequently hard to change it even within one browser once you ship even a trial implementation, which is why most of us are actually now being tighter about how we ship what we refer to as experimental things. And experimental things are, you know, border radius was experimental for what felt like a decade before it actually, you know, started being implemented without a prefix and interoperable across all different browsers. So I mean, it's really important to understand shipping something like that. There's a high cost to it for a browser vendor. Like if we had shipped grid layout in Chrome a year ago, we would still have to support that somehow. Like we'd still have to figure out how to go migrate content or, you know, keep from breaking people badly.
And that's
change that.
And that's actually, it's not just on the browser vendors. It's also the workload on developers. If you have 5 different ways of doing things and 2 of them don't work well, how do you get the word out there? When developers are learning how to do things, we could build an incredibly complex platform that's very hard to use and hard to know when to use the right thing. So we are trying to actively make a set of decisions around what things do we need to add to the platform to make the developer's job easier, not harder? And so just editor's note, one thing, CR has come up a few times. CR stands for candidate recommendation, and that's the phase during the spec making process where we test implementations, where we make tests and we make implementations, and that's where we, so if you hear CR, that's what that means. And also, Alan has a lot of experience with desktop publishing. He worked on InDesign, so he knows from layout. Chris has worked for both Google and Microsoft, so he has insight there. And Fantasy has worked for every browser vendor.
Not quite.
I think,
I did an intern at Opera, I've been with Mozilla, and I did a contract with Microsoft, and I've worked for HP.
okay, so not every browser vendor. So we had another question over here. Sorry
yeah.
to make you wait.
Oh, it's fine. Jen Simmons from the Web Ahead. So 15, 18 years ago, we were in the middle of the browser wars where Netscape and IE were fighting and refusing to work with each other, trying everything they could to be better by being different. The landscape is very different today. We, especially the last year or two, as Microsoft has very publicly said, we like open standards now, we're on board, we want to play nice, right? So these major corporations, Apple, Google, Microsoft, there is, I don't know, this might be the only area in which they've agreed publicly that they're going to collaborate and they're going to work together and they're going to agree to implement the W3 spec, right? Amazing, amazing. So my question is, this is still really hard. So why is it hard? What is hard about this now when you get to say it's not the thing I just described? Why is this hard?
Yes, but first I want to plug something. So there's another project that all the browser vendors and Adobe and Intel and HP and others are working on. That's webplatform.org, because we recognize that as the platform gets more complex, we need not only specifications, but we need developer documentation. And so we started a site called webplatform.org for you to help. It's basically a Wikipedia for web developers. And that part makes it a little bit easier for developers. Your question was, even with everybody cooperating, why is it still so hard? Yeah. And I think you had an answer to that. And I think it involves a knife, so everybody back away.
Okay, where's this plug? Here we go. Is it showing up yet?
It's not. So go ahead.
Should I answer
Yes.
this
Yeah.
while she's...
Yeah.
So I did want to say a couple of things, because while you were talking, Jen, it reminded me of a few things. And I want to be clear before I say anything here that I have a ton of respect for what Microsoft is doing in the standard space right now. But you said something like, Microsoft made a commitment of we're going to collaborate on this in the open standards. We made that commitment in like 1996, 97, something like that. And actually, for the most part, it was true. Like, we were collaborating in that. I think the reason why it's so hard is that fundamentally the people building browsers have a bunch of different motivations. They have a bunch of different markets they're shooting for. They have a bunch of different ideas of why they're building a browser even. I mean, if you look at the core of why Apple builds a browser versus why Microsoft builds a browser versus why Google builds a browser versus why Mozilla builds a browser and Opera and, like, keep going down the list, they're subtly different, but radically different in a number of ways. And I think that gives them different motivations for what they want to do in the browser space. I think that you'll also discover that on top of that, of course, there's actual developers and people building things on top of that platform, and what they want out of the platform may be entirely different as well. And that makes it even harder to figure out exactly what the platform should be, and then you'll get the implementations to support it. It's great, actually, now that we have a lot better interoperability and collaboration between those sets of people, but it certainly is still a hard challenge.
So I'm also curious, we have two other kinds of implementers up here. We have somebody from open source, and we have somebody from an authoring tool vendor. And I'd be interested to hear why it's so hard for you guys to cooperate. No. So So maybe you guys can talk about a little bit about your perspectives, about your motivations, et cetera, in participating in the process.
Getting no takers here.
Well, I participate. I work with Inkscape, and I participate because there are things that Inkscape users want to see in the SVG spec, because we use SVG as our native file format. For example, mesh gradients, text that auto-flows into a region. And so my participation is motivated to get those things into the spec, and also to correct things that don't work that well in the SVG 1.1 spec, like having that arrowhead color automatically match the color of the stroke of the line that it's attached to. So that's my
it's
main.
more of a, your agenda is specifically to meet the needs of your authoring tool users.
Yes.
And
who tend to be tend to be artists, and maybe what they're doing is not meant to be on the web in the end. You know, some do put stuff on the web, some is just for drawing.
So my group at Adobe is actually more of an open source contributor than anything else. So we do have tools, and we do try to get some of the things that we're working on into our tools, but that's not the primary motivation. The primary motivation for us is just making the web a more expressive medium so that our customers can do the things that they want on the web.
so a similar motivation to Inkscape.
Yep.
Okay, so we've said that specs are hard. I want to show a little demonstration of that. This is not the border radius spec. This is not a layout feature. This is something you use to decorate the box once it's already been laid out, so we know what the size is, we know where everything goes, we just want to make it a round corner. You're like, you know, like a border radius is so easy. I could write a spec for it in one paragraph, and like just this little table, and then we have our paragraph. And then like, ta-da, it's all done. Like, why was that hard? Well, you're like, well, if you have multiple values, then you have to like explain how they correspond. Okay, not too bad. But then you get to the point where you're like, well, what if you're joining two different widths of the border? How does that supposed to work? You have to write about that and explain how that's supposed to work. And especially if that border radius goes all the way to the edges, you notice that the inner circle is not a quarter circle. So, you know, you got to make sure you point that out so the implementers get it right and don't make weird shapes. And then there's the issue of, well, what happens when you have overflow hidden on something? What part gets clipped? And if you have scroll bars, then where do the scroll bars go if it's rounded on the corners? And then there's, well, what if somebody has different colors, one on the top and one on the side? Or different styles, like one's dotted and the other one's double? Or what happens if the border radii are too big to fit in the box? So we had to come up with a formula for like, how do you make it fit in the box? You scale all of them? Do you scale just the one that's too big? Like, what do you do? So then we had that. And then you also get to the point where you're on tables. Like tables, you've got a border that's shared by two different boxes. How do you deal with that? So we have to add some paragraphs about that. That is the border radius spec right there. It's several pages of text for something that's really, really dead simple. And like I said, layout is a lot harder than this. So, yes.
So, sorry.
Years on this particular tech.
But years.
Yeah. But it's like, we aren't a working group that works on border radius exclusively, so like, we're working on a lot of things at the same time. And so it ends up taking a long time because we're multitasking. The total amount of time is not years.
And this is a feature on which most people agree. Like most of the implementers already agreed on the feature. They already agreed on what they wanted on the functionality. It took all this effort to do something they all agreed about. Sometimes they don't agree. So that's a lot of where the difficulty. Even if they all want to participate in web standards, they may not agree on the best way to solve a particular problem. The W3C isn't a government so much. I mean, we can't tell the browser vendors what to do. We're more like the UN, where we let people sort out their differences, and we try to help where we can, and we try not to hinder. That's harder.
So the browser vendor is the United States in that analogy.
Don't
So next question.
Sorry, you're going to have to stand in line. There's other people waiting.
So we only have a few more minutes in this, so let's, I think we have 2 or 3 more questions.
Yeah. Quick question. So the customers in the company I work for, they have very old browsers. They're big corporates, basically IE7, IE8. That's it. So I wonder if you know of any initiative that tries to solve this problem and tries to help those kind of IT operations in those companies to move faster.
So there actually are a number of companies who basically go and figure out how to make the situation for enterprises like that better. In fact, one of them is some XIE guys that were close friends of mine who started Browsium that does like multi-browser hosting, including versions of IE and other browsers so that it can automatically switch back and forth between browsers in as seamless a way as possible for users. It's a really challenging thing to do. And this is, of course, on top of what IE already does internally to have old browser modes to try to make that situation better in enterprise. But it is a challenging thing to do.
Browsing is a very expensive product.
Off the top of my head, no, but there was at least one more that I remember talking to. Do you remember? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just tweak one word that you use. It's not just challenging; it's expensive. Even if you don't use a solution like Browsium, if you want to move up, and I'm sure that for your day-to-day job, like your line of business apps and things that run on the web are really critical. And so we know that's important for enterprises, and so we work with enterprises all the time to get them to newer versions as well. And you know, like I said, document compatibility modes, those kinds of things are steps that we're taking.
So keeping with some of the analogies that came up so far, does the W3C have a roadmap in general that you guys follow, or do you keep getting sidetracked by the local and very strong minority that keeps coming up in your mailing lists?
We have a general aim, but the market changes. I mean, before tablets, right? Were we addressing the tablet case? Well, for some things we were, but for a lot of things we weren't. And tablets come on the scene, and suddenly there's a whole swath of specs that deal with tablets, right? There are other specifications that last beyond when they, like SVG 1.2 Tiny was a specification that was meant for just above feature phones, right? Not for smartphones. So this middle ground that existed for about 6 years, right? And by the time it came out, the work we put on that spec, it was almost useless because that market had shifted underneath us. And that's a problem. It's hard to anticipate that. So we know that we have certain principles that we want to adhere to, right? We want to have interoperability, we want to have accessibility, we want to have internationalization. We have these sorts of high-level goals, but within those goalposts, I mean, it also depends on what the browser vendors are interested in, and styles change. You know, at one point, people wanted to have rounded corners, and now they want to have flat design. So there's a lot of things that change with how people. Rounded corners is a bad example, but like you might want to have textured things, and then now the style is flat. Well, which one do you address, right? We have to keep adjusting to the market at the time. Chris always has something.
As far as the sort of vocal minority problem goes, I think that's a problem that we've all run into, but generally the best way to solve it is with strong spec editorship to some degree to manage that and make sure that all feedback is taken into context. But I think that a really good working group chair does more than anything to manage the vocal minority versus building consensus across a group problem.
So is there an 80-20 rule that is followed, and who makes that decision?
So ultimately, it comes down to it's sort of the editor. If the editor doesn't agree with the rest of the working group, the chair moderates that. The chairs of the group will try to moderate that and try to build consensus. If it comes down to a total disagreement, it will ultimately get bumped up to the director, which is ultimately Tim Berners-Lee, and so he decides. He doesn't have to step in very often because we try to solve things with consensus at a lower level.
I'm also a member of the advisory board, and one of the things we do is we advise the team on the process, capital P process. The W3C has this huge long spec about process. In general, I would say the way this works in most of the working groups I've been involved in is the goal is to build consensus. There are many different ways to do this. There's many checks and balances. One of them is it gets booted to the director to make a decision. This sounds like the director gets to be a dictator. It actually doesn't really work that way. In general, what happens is they build a loose consensus, and if somebody really objects, they make a formal objection. All formal objections have to be explicitly dealt with. So if the director wants to override a formal objection, he has to say so, he has to say why. And that goes to the advisory council. The advisory council sees all of that. People can walk out of the room if this isn't working, and then I think this whole thing falls apart. So the goal is to not have people walk out of the room.
Is there a community which? I'm sorry.
So the one last thing is all the specifications have a mailing list attached to the top of the specification. So if you have a question or you have a formal objection or if you have feedback, you should email the working group and say, listen, this is, why didn't it happen this way? Oh, so we're getting the wind it up signal, sorry. So maybe, I think that's it. So I'm sorry. If you have questions, you can find us all up here.